Howdy, everybody. This is Billy Martel, and today I thought I'd try something a little bit different. I'm going to try my hand at reviewing a comic book. Now, this is a story from Batman number 6. Batman number 6 was published August and September of 1941. And back in the day, comic books were a lot different than they are now. Instead of having just part of a longer story, they would actually have a lot of shorter stories. And this is one of the last stories in Batman number 6. It's called Suicide Beat. And see, a lot of Batman at the time was kind of a ripoff, or at least a takeoff on a genre, a very popular genre at the time, is the pulp hero. And particularly, they took off from the adventures of a very popular pulp hero at the time, the Shadow, who I've talked about on this channel before. The Shadow's thing was always to say, the weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows. So Batman also had this sort of message. He would always say, crime doesn't pay. He would always teach kids not to look up to gangsters, because remember, this is in the 30s and the 40s. So the 1920s, when Al Capone was a national hero as well as a mass murderer, was not that long ago. So he would always talk to kids and say, kids, remember, gangsters are not heroes. The heroes are the police and the military who protect you. So this story in particular is about the Suicide Beat, which in Gotham City is a particular street where every cop who's ever been assigned that street as a beat, for those who aren't in on the lingo, a beat is where a patrolman will walk a beat, will walk a certain area and patrol that area. That's their assigned neighborhood, so to speak. Every cop who's been assigned this beat has been murdered, without fail. Every single one. This is the narration that starts the book. When killers mock the law and taunt the blue-coated protectors of society, then it is time for the Batman to make his timely entrance. With his laughing young aide, Robin, the boy wonder, this master crime smasher penetrates the hidden layer of the denizens of the underworld and meets their measures with swift actions of his own. Follow the Batman now as he fares forth on another mission, ferreting out and crushing the evil on Suicide Beat. So again, it establishes right off the bat that every cop that takes the Suicide Beat, and I should point out right off the bat, this is in the 1940s. This is before Gotham City was depicted as the crime-ridden, Dirty Harry-inspired city that Frank Miller eventually turned it into. At this point, Gotham City is just a normal city with a normal crime rate. But this particular street is particularly bad. So an officer, in the beginning of the story, an officer named Grogan is shot because apparently he was getting too close to a gangster who controls the Suicide Beat named Fancy Dan. And the cop says, no wonder they call this Suicide Beat. Any cop that gets his beat practically commits suicide. Fancy Dan sees to that. Grogan is the third cop to be found dead here. I pity the poor guy who gets his beat next. So do I. So next, the next cop who gets assigned this beat, because of course they have to assign someone to that beat, regardless of how dangerous it is an officer named Kelly. Now, Kelly is shown to be a very old-timey, sort of very respectful, middle-aged cop, Irish. All the good cops in these stories are usually Irish. He gets assigned to the beat. They say he's an experienced man, so we know this guy's a good cop. But he doesn't seem all that concerned about taking over the beat, and the other cops ask him why. Kelly, you look mighty cheerful for a man who has to take over the Suicide Beat. Well, why shouldn't Kelly be smiling? Didn't you hear that his son Jimmy gets his badge today? Sure, And what man wouldn't be proud of a son like me boy Jimmy? 'Tis a blessed day that he becomes our lucky policeman. 2 generations of Kelly policemen. Well, I hope he's a better cop than his old man. Quiet, I'll have me Jimmy lock up the bothy. So the story within only a few panels already gives us an idea of what a kind of a guy Kelly is, and we already kind of like him. And we see Kelly at midnight walking the beat of the suicide beat. And immediately, before he even has a chance to move in on Fancy Dan or anything of that nature, this is how brazen people are on Suicide Beat. A gangster working for Fancy Dan comes out of the shadows and blows him away. That'll teach you coppers to stay out of Fancy Dan's territory. And almost immediately, Jim, Kelly's son, remember Jim, is on the scene at his father's body, mourning his father. He says, "Who shot him? Who killed my father?" "Probably one of Fancy Dan's boys," this other unnamed cop says. "Well, what are you waiting for? Why don't we arrest him?" "Because they need evidence, Jimmy. Even I know that. I don't even have to read further." "Take it easy, Jimmy. If we did arrest Fancy Dan or his mobsters, we couldn't prove anything. You see, son, Fancy Dan runs this neighborhood. Has for a long time. Whenever we do pin a little something on him, he manages to wiggle out of it. He's got protection. The rotten political boss of this ward is his silent partner. As soon as a policeman starts to get anything on him, he gets shot. That's why your father was killed. He had a reputation as a good cop. Fancy Dan was afraid of him." So yeah, this street is so bad. The citizenry supports not only the political boss, but the citizenry supports the local mob rather than supporting the police. And the police can't do anything about it. And the mob is so brazen on the street that they just shoot any cop that they think might be a problem for them in the future. That is an effective system that they have worked out there. But Jimmy, even though he's a new cop on the force, he says, "I want the suicide beat. Fancy Dan killed my father. I'm gonna get Fancy Dan. I'm gonna get him if it's the last thing I do." So for such an inexperienced officer, he's taking on quite the handful. And the cop that he was talking to, again, unnamed, goes back to Commissioner Gordon to talk to him about it. He says, "I know I gave the rookie a tough beat, but I've got a hunch he'll pin something on Fancy Dan." He believes in Jimmy. He believes in him. Maybe unwisely, but he believes in him. He says, "If he doesn't, we'll be pinning something on him. A wreath." But Bruce Wayne, who is a friend of Commissioner Gordon's, of course, happens to be visiting, and he says, "At least the boy will get the cooperation of the people on those streets, won't he? A crooked politician runs the streets. He's a smart politician. He lends the poor people money, buys them food on Christmas, finds men jobs, etc. Asks in return that they vote for him and protect his jackals. Naturally, the police do just as he says, and hate cops. Jimmy won't get any help from them." So, a crooked politician who has ties with the mob has been supporting the people. He's been providing for the people's needs, helping them to get jobs, helping to support them when they're in tough times. So it seems like the reason why the people of the street don't trust cops is because the cops don't do much for them, really. Everything that they need is provided by the mafia, including, to their minds, protection from outside forces, ergo the police. The police, for some reason, have given them reason to mistrust them, whereas the mob basically serve as community protection, not only from violence, but also from economic and societal depression. So it kind of makes sense why the people would be more inclined to believe in what the mafia could tell them than what the police could tell them. So that afternoon, Jimmy Kelly, grim and silent, takes on his suicide beat, and the people are staring at him and just giving him the evil eye. And then one of the kids even goes out of his way to throw a piece of fruit, an unidentifiable piece of fruit, at the back of Jimmy's head. "Why, you little..." And he chases him into Pete's bar. And he says, "A little kid ran in here. Where did he go?" "I didn't see no kid." "But you must have seen him. He ran right in here." "I didn't see no kid." "If he didn't see no kid, he didn't see no kid, Kappa. Fancy Dan. So you're the new cheese around here. Me, I don't like coppers. And that's a good tip, kid. See what I mean? Come on, me boys. I don't like the atmosphere in this place now. My father's a murderer. I could kill him now so easy, but that's not a cop's way. I'll get him the way Pop would have, and I'll get him." So he says it's not a cop's way. A cop's way is not violence for violence's sake. A cop's way is the thinking man's way. A cop's way is innocent until proven guilty. But later, a car driven by one of Fancy Dan's boys, although we don't know that yet, drives down the street and almost runs down a little girl named Anna, who I believe is supposed to be the little girl of the guy who owns Pete's bar, but it's very unclear about that in the comic. And Jimmy, being the good kid that he is, throws himself in the path of the car and manages to somehow survive himself and also help the little girl survive. Batman and Robin happen to be going past the suicide beat and jump in a car. I guess they didn't bring the Batmobile with them this time. They commandeer a car and chase after the car that was being used to hit and run that little girl. It says, on screaming tires, they draw abreast of the drunken driver's racing car. "I'll plug you full of holes!" A gun, too. That completes the picture. In this era, Batman didn't use guns, not necessarily because of his parents, but because he's always teaching kids only cowards use guns to solve their problems. "What you need is something to put you to sleep, and this is it." Okay, I think maybe rendering a driver unconscious, even if he is a drunk driver, only adds to the problem, but whatever, I'm not Batman, so. And Batman hands the drunk driver over to Jimmy Kelly. "Here, take care of this rat. Adios." The Batman, how? Jimmy drags the drunk to jail, but the next day, Alderman Skeeg appears. Alderman Skeeg, although they did not establish this at all in the story, in the writing of the story, is the dirty politician that they've been talking about, who provides for this neighborhood. Basically, he gets the guy off. Yes, it turns out that this drunk driver was a guy who was working for Fancy Dan, a rat bastard. Skeeg asks them not to shoot Jimmy Kelly. Says, "Get rid of him, but no shooting. 3 dead cops in a row might bring the governor down on us." Skeeg is right. We'll just muss him up enough so that he goes to the hospital. Me, I got an idea. So the next day they have a bit of a ploy. They have 2 of their boys get into a fight, and when Jimmy Kelly comes to break it up, they start attacking him, and a whole bunch of other hoods come out to beat him up so that he'll get the message and be sent to the hospital. Now Batman and Robin suddenly show up here again. Turns out Batman and Robin are hanging around Suicide Beat a lot more recently because of the recent cop killings. So now begins a part of the story that I'm less interested in. It's more of like it's more of a weird side thing where they find out that there's a betting thing that the politician is tied up in, that he's going to make a lot of money based on who wins the next fight. And when they find out that one of the fighters is going to throw the fight, Batman replaces the fighter in the ring and beats the guy to make sure the politician loses money, and make sure that he's going to be a little bit more desperate going forward. It's one of the sillier aspects of this universe that Batman is like in the 60s, a duly deputized agent of the law, not a vigilante, and that he is very active as a public figure in Gotham City. which I guess makes more sense than him being a grim vigilante since he becomes a member of the Justice League later on. He's not a member of the Justice League yet at this point, but as a member of the Justice League, he is a public figure. So it doesn't make much sense to me whenever they say, oh, no one knows if the Batman really exists or not. He's on the news all the time fighting Starro the Conqueror. He exists. So in retaliation for Batman's playing with Batman reversing their fortune on them, Fancy Dan and the politician end up stealing the gate receipts for the fight. So essentially, the mobster illegal gambling equivalent of taking your ball and going home, I guess. Batman pursues Fancy Dan and his crooks with the gate receipts and ends up being captured and almost burned alive. He leaves them in an abandoned warehouse covered in gasoline and sets it on fire. And Batman is all tied up. I'm in the spot. But thankfully, Robin is able to get with Jimmy Kelly and try and figure out where Fancy Dan might have placed Batman. And it just turns out that because of what Jimmy Kelly did to save the little girl's life earlier in the story, that Pete, the owner of Pete's Bar, is willing to help them.
You saved my little girl Anna's life. The least I can do is repay you this way. I saw Fancy Dan and his mob take Batman into number 14 on the next street.
Someone on suicide beat helping a cop. I can't believe it. See, what Jimmy's found is that by putting the same kind of care and compassion into the community that Jimmy Kelly, that Fancy Dan had done, even though Fancy Dan had done it for selfish reasons, the fact that Jimmy Kelly was able to put the same kind of care and compassion that Fancy Dan had put into it initially, but in a more honest way, has resulted in the community being on his side and helping him to catch the crooks rather than supporting them. Because they've now seen that by working with the cops, and by the cops working with them, that they can create a better community for everyone, rather than resorting to illegal means to protect themselves. So Jimmy Kelly shows up with Robin, they beat back the crooks, and then they see that the building is on fire. The Batman, he must be inside. I'm going in after him. My baby, she's in there too. Look, the Batman, and he's got my baby. He's trapped. I've got to help him. Somebody hold this Robin kid back. This is my job. Robin is fine. He's a superhero. Why are you being so... hold this Robin kid back. Jeez. Even as Jimmy darts forward into the house next door, the ancient flimsy dwelling goes up in flames. So now the fire is catching to all the different buildings, and Fancy Dan and his crew, in their attempt to retaliate back at Batman for messing up their game, they're burning down the very neighborhood that they were trying to support. And he's on the roof and he's looking at Batman and says, "Can you jump it?"
No. Can't take a chance with a kid in my arms. This roof will cave in any moment. Only one thing to do. Get ready. Catch!
So you couldn't risk jumping with the kid in your arms, but you can risk tossing the kid like a football? Okay, Batman. Okay. World's greatest detective. But Jimmy Kelly, of course, does catch the kid, and they set up one of those little fire building trampolines, and Jimmy Kelly jumps into it, Batman jumps into it as well, and they're all saved. And Skeeg shows up just at that moment. "Well, it's you, Skeeg. Just in time for me to take you in." What is that?" "It's only just that you not only rigged up a phony charity fight, but you also fixed it so Fancy Dan would steal the gate receipts." And they established earlier on that the gate receipts were going to be used to buy milk for the kids of the neighborhood. So while he was supporting the kids of the neighborhood, he was also screwing them over at the same time, I guess.
"Well, Jimmy, I guess you won't have any more trouble on Suicide Beat."
"Yes, and if I know my crooks, Fancy Dan and his men will talk plenty down at headquarters. Thank you. Thanks to you." "But how did you get free?"
"I managed to reach a steel blade I had hidden in the heel of my boot. Close call, though. Say, I wonder what the people will think of Jimmy now."
So Batman escaped because of the same bullshit reason as always. He's Batman. The next day, the answer to Batman's question. Hello, Jimmy. Fine day. It certainly is. It certainly is a fine day. So, like I was saying, the early Batman stories, it partially in order to make sure that parents were okay with their kids reading them, were very in support of the police department. And so they always said crime does not pay. But the caveat that is given with this story is that police work works because policemen are nonviolent, they use their heads, they assume that people are innocent until proven guilty, and that they engage with their communities and put the lives of the people that they have been charged to protect before their own. And that when a police officer engages with their community on that level, protecting human life, upholding law and order, not in that the guilty are always punished and punished severely in a Dirty Harry-esque kind of way, but law and order in that sort of almost socialistic sense, in that as a community, people are brought together in an orderly way that serves the entire community and in a lawful way that protects the community. Only then can policemen serve their community. Only with the trust of the people they protect. And that trust can only be earned if the policemen are willing to stick their necks out for us, the people. And if the policemen are not willing to stick their necks out for us, if they're just going to wander around whistling Dixie looking like a bunch of glossy stormtroopers, the people will look for protection elsewhere. And this is how you get people who glorify being involved in gangs, being involved in mob mentalities, being involved in criminal activity over being lawful citizens, by making a world, by making a society that distrusts their police force because they've seen that the police force do not have their best interests in mind. In those cases, people will find other people to protect them. And when the police force become criminals in their own communities, where are people going to look for protection than the criminals? Because those are the only people that they have left to protect them. So I guess if I were to rate this comic, I would give it a abolish the police out of 10. Abolish the police. See y'all later.